All right, let's get started. So this is one of the first live streams for coding, and in this live stream, I want to have a look at one of the issues that we were looking at for being able to request different assets inside of OpenSpace with different parameters. So one of the ideas for this would be that if we, for example, have a look at one of the assets that we're already having, let's say, for instance, let's look at Earth. So for Earth, well, we currently don't, but for the Earth labels, we have one of the parameters that is called enabled false. So by default, when we're loading this asset, then the label would be not visible. So this would be one of the parameters that we would want to pass in to dynamically, or rather from the caller side, determine whether we want to enable the this renderable or not. So if we create like an example case, a new asset called require test that we want to, there we go. Good evening, Himmelskukka. So let's take one of the examples that we have, and let's take one of the grids. So we're saying we're one of our grids. All of this stuff we don't really need. And now we have this enabled parameter. So now what we want to say is, instead of enabled false, ultimately what we want to be able to say is something like asset enabled content, or something along those lines. And now whoever calls this asset or includes this asset, they would be determining what this parameter actually is. So if we want to continue along this, we would say require test parent. And for this, the only thing that we want to do is to require the current, well, the require test that we were just looking at. So this is all standard in OpenSpace already, that we can request another asset and just load that at runtime. But now the new thing would be that I can say whether I want this to be enabled or not enabled. So the magic here is that this would be happening on the parent level rather than predetermined by us. So it would be easier for creating new scenes where you want to show something that is not really visible by default. But let's make this one happen first. So what we're doing is we have our new asset, which we call require test parent. So we want to load this one, and basically, let's see what happens if we start OpenSpace. We should be seeing just a radial grid. And the camera is probably very weird. Let me move this one over. Yes, so we're loading up OpenSpace and nothing is really happening because we don't have a user interface or anything. So that's kind of not good. So we can't even really see what is happening. Let us just quickly add the user interface, which we can take from here. Which we take the default key bindings, if I can find them over here. There we go. So we take our parent and then also add the default key binds so that we can at least open the user interface to have a look at if the assets was loaded correctly or not. we go. So now we have the user interface, default keybinds. Now we did not load anything. Why would that be the case? So we did initialize our required test, but nothing showed up. Oh, that is because we just created it, but didn't actually say anything. So we go back to the example. We have our asset helper down here that we can register a scene graph node, so we actually get it in the scene graph node, in the scene graph itself as well. So let's do that. So now we should probably get an error message that asset enable content is not known or something along those lines. But now at least we have our grid. I mean, it doesn't show up or anything, but at least we know that it's in the scene now. So that's good. So let's try. So we have, let's close all of the ones that we don't need. So we're requiring our new require test asset that we just created. And now we want to have a parameter that we pass into this that then gets used down here in the enabled. So let's just for simplicity output that value at load time. And let's actually make that a fatal error so we can see it more quickly. So we'll start up again. And now we should get somewhere a fatal warning. A fatal warning, exactly. So could not load asset, error executing script, expected 1 argument, got 2. So that is the problem that we're calling. This require method with 2 parameters, even though we only have coded 1 of them. So that's now where the work begins. So the asset require, that method is defined in our asset loader. We have a require Lua function. So we're checking how many parameters did we pass into this function, which is exactly the error message that we just got. We extract the asset that we want to include, reset the whole Lua state, create an asset, require an asset, and then we go from there. So what we can start doing is that we now have either 1 or 2 parameters. And let's just return the number of parameters back. And if the number of parameters are 2, then we get back content enabled, and we extract our Boolean parameter from there. There we go. Our Lua state and the second parameter. So just making sure that everything's working. Let's print that one out. So now when we run this, we should be seeing true in here for the require test printed to the console. So let's see how that works. Compiling. Compiling and some linking. And here we go. And we got a require test and a 1, which is true. So we actually correctly passed this one. And, good. So what do we want to do? First of all, we want to have a default parameter. We don't really want to change anything, any behavior. So by default, we'll just set everything to false. if we have our parameter reloaded from the Lua state, which means that if the user specifies which kind of parameter they want, we get that, otherwise we get false. And now we pass that into the require method, I think. Yes, so now we want to actually associate with the asset that we want to have its content enabled. So if we go to the asset itself, well, add a new parameter, new member variable down here just to keep track of everything. And that we just call as content enabled, which will also default to false, just in case we don't write anything to it at some point. And well, we're getting the asset here, so we'll probably need some kind of setter for that. We'll just put down here. That we just put in the right place as well. So now our asset has a new member variable and a way for us to setting it. And of course, we also need to be able to request that. Let's give this function. Here we go. All right, so now we have a way to set whether we want to have the content enabled or not. So when we do this, we get our dependency, and now we set our dependency set content enabled to the value that we just got out of this. Great. So now we can do the require. So in the require, we're going in, blah, 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 requiring the assets, and we're loading our child here, if it's not already loaded. And the loader will go into the load function will go into the loader, load an asset, and now here's actually the call that will call, like the function that will call that new child asset. So now what we want to do is basically pass into this function that we just have, that we want to have the child enable all of its assets. I think this is all being set in the set current asset, if I'm not terribly mistaken. I might be mistaken on this, but we'll see how that goes. Let's just make a quick trick and see if that works. So we're in the asset loader, we have our assets, so we can, we have our Lua state. Actually, now the question, now reaching a bit of the limits of my, out of the top of my head Lua knowledge. So we want to add this to our Lua state. So actually, we don't want to do that just in the set current asset, but rather in the function where we set up our asset Lua table. So this is the function that sets up our asset, where we can call local resource, synced resource, the require method that we were just looking at, and so forth. So we actually want to be able to set that in here. So we set our table, setting our indices. So let's check where we can do that. So I guess we could try that down here, where we want to push a Boolean onto the Lua state. And that would be whether it should, no, how we call it, content enabled. So we put our Boolean onto the stack, And then we say we want to save this boolean as in our table as, let's just call this content enabled for now. Can clean this up later still. Now, if I'm not terribly mistaken, it should be now in that table. So didn't really get anything before, right? Let's just try that. So if we just compile everything now and we're running this. Can wait for it to compile again. We can probably put this into a different constant a bit later and make that a bit cleaner. But there needs to be a second pass on all of this anyway, so it can happen at that point. Okay, so let's see. So we're loading up. Now we shouldn't get that error message anymore that we can't call it with a second one. And let's see. That is interesting. So we have our required test here. Let's just verify that we're actually calling all of this as well. Initializing the modules. Where is it? There. Okay, so we're loading the asset required test parent, which is this one. And then we're initializing this asset. So why are we not printing anything? That is curious. So I guess we're just trying to print anything. And we run this again. Maybe it's something that went wrong with the setting of the Boolean variable or something. We'll see how that goes now. Yes, so at least this message will be printed. That's good. So I guess we need to make this a bit roundabout. So if enable content, then we want to print true. Otherwise, we want to print false. Not really sure why the Boolean variable shouldn't be able to be printed, but well, that's a problem for future me. There we go. Okay, that's not good. So we're getting a false, which means that the variable is actually false and not true as we want it to. So let's see how we can fix that. So I guess the question is when this function gets called. So this might get called at a state when the variable hasn't been set yet. Let's just double check that it's actually correct one. Move this. There we go. It's enable content and content enabled. That would help. So let's try that again. So Lua was very helpful and not warn us about a variable not existing, but just assuming that it's false if it doesn't exist. So that's fantastic. But it doesn't really help. So we have content enabled to which we set this variable. So let's just check at which point we're actually setting this Lua table, because I'm expecting that this is happening at a place when we haven't set the internal variable yet. Okay, so we're currently looking at I want to have a look at what the asset is that we're loading, because this is probably still the parent. Text. Yes, so that this is still the parent. That's not good. but we can at least check when that is happening. So calling setup Lua from track asset, from get asset, from request. So this would basically be the same. So we're calling the functions that we added were after the get call. Check, so where was that? There we go. So we're calling the get asset, and the get asset already sets up the asset Lua table. So I guess we don't really need any of this, and we just pass in the parameters directly. So come on, get asset. We check if it's already loaded, which should take this parameter into consideration anyway. So what that means is that let's leave this in place, so we don't call this directly, but rather we call content enabled on this get asset method. This is private variables, private function, so that's not really a problem. We muck this up. So here we go. So now we're passing in this parameter, and this unfortunately goes into the track. So I'm not sure if we want to do this at all times. So why would the asset Lua table need to be set up if we want to track it? That doesn't seem to be related at all. Who's calling you? No one. Then let's make this track. Seems to be very related to this, but that's kind of stupid, isn't it? Okay, this one gets called from somewhere, so that's not good either. But no one really does call you, does he? Okay, so. Well, let's see what breaks. If we make this one private. So once we have this private, we can start messing around with this a bit more freely, because we know we're not going to break anyone, because no one can call us. Yeah, so we got one message that we can't call get asset with one parameter, so that's fine. It's that one. Well, we broke the function, but didn't really fix anything afterwards. So that's fine. And the request, that's all a bit outgoing anyway, so let's just put a little to do here. Reminding us that this is just a hack. So one of the other changes that we're in the middle of doing is to just get rid of the request part and just use require everywhere. So that's kind of a neater and more cleaner way to handle all of the dependencies, because no one's really seemed to be using the request method either way. So we can just hack that for now. So now we're having the content enabled. So this one should probably put in a to do here as well from today. It should probably check if we have loaded assets. So this is one of the things that we're definitely not going to get to today, is that if I require an asset twice, once with the parameter saying true, once with it being false, because in that case we just need to do the true version. but like right now we're just checking if it has already been enabled or not, and like depending on the order, there's some stuff that we need to do anyway. So there's gonna be some two-phase lookup that's gonna happen anyway. So let's see. So this function never gets called by anyone, does it? So why do we have it? Seems to be not a very useful building block. See if the compiler tells us if we actually need it. That does not seem to be the case. So then we'll get rid of this entirely. And now we're having our track asset method that gets called somewhere down here. Okay, I guess you didn't want me to do the copy and pasting. There we go. So we're just calling it down here, and then the same with the untrack asset. And now these functions don't exist anymore. So this is good because now where were we in the get asset method? No, actually, I wanted to call the get asset method. So now we're passing in whether this our content should be enabled or not. And then down here we can set up our Lua table, at which point we can pass this in. So now our setup Lua table. There we go. Whether the content. That's actually stupid. Let's not pass it in as a parameter because we're already passing in the asset. So, and we're already getting the value out of the asset. So what we can do instead is does that make sense? Yes, so we're creating a new asset and then we're setting whether the content is enabled or not directly on the asset before we add it into the tracked assets, which, well, see upstairs to do, and then we're setting up our Lua table. So let's try if this one works. Everyone's favorite pastime, waiting for compilation to finish. So we should hit our breakpoint, which now, come on, there we go. Well, this is the first breakpoint, so it should be false because we're loading our parent. Yes. So if we hit the parameter, the breakpoint the second time, now this should be true. If everything went sort of well. Yep, there we go. So if we now continue to the end. So now, there we go. We have our true parameter. That's success. So now it would be nice to be able to see something rather than just a printout message. Let's see if we have the rendering. Can we make the... There we go. So here we have our example radial grid. That's now one of the new things that we can add thanks to Emma. So what happens if I now say, no, I actually don't want that to show up. So now what should be happening is if I focus the camera on it, it should be invisible. And it is not enabled. So that's fantastic. And here we go. Cool. So that works. And with minimal amount of dirtiness as well. That seems to be pretty neat. So now we have a content enabled flag that gets passed in from the parent. So we're saying we wanted to clean this one up a bit, so we can do that right now. Content enable, that's not how you spell that. Enable name. Down here. Okay, so I guess that works. So I guess it would be nice to tell someone if we have this problem with multiple requires. So I guess the issue is, where do I have my tablet? To illustrate the problem that we're running into. Here we go. Let's say we're having our asset A. Oh my god, the parameters are all wrong. Yeah, I do not want to map it to the whole. Go. So let's try this. Let's try the square one more. This is much more square-like. Great. So now we're having our assets. So we're from our open space CFG, we're loading our asset A. And then the problem would be that now we're loading an asset B, which loads an asset C with the parameter being true. But then also we're loading from A an asset D that also wants to load C, but now with false. And the problem is that we have pretty much well, because the initialization is multi-threaded, like whether this one is happening first or this one is happening first is kind of undetermined. So depending on which one we choose first, we will either get the C with true or with false. Because the moment we're trying to load the C again, the code that we just looked at will determine that, well, this had already been loaded, so there's no need to do that anymore. So like I said, I don't think we'll be able to fix that right now because it will require some more work, but at least we could warn a user about the fact that it did happen and that something weird might be happening. So let's see if we can make that happen. So we did have our tracked asset somewhere. So right now our tracked asset is just working based on the path. And I guess what we want to do is extend this to do a string and our Boolean variable. Let's just make a safety commit for now, because we have something working and that's kind of nice. No need to push this to anyone. There we go. So what we want to do is, instead of just looking our assets up by string, we want to look it up by string and by Boolean. And then here a lot of people will be unhappy all of a sudden. Unload our asset. Well, I guess this could be whether the content is enabled or not. And we need to construct a pair out of this. And down here, this is where the magic happens. I I guess what we want to do is get it with false and with true and seeing if one of them is the good one. Let's see, so we have a... Yeah, let's do that. So we'll get our true iterator. So we see if it exists with true. And we get our false iterator, which means we get our asset that we loaded, but with false. So I guess, so what would be the problem case? So the problem case would be if the content enabled variable, the parameter is, if this one's true and false has been set, but true hasn't, that means that someone loaded the asset with false and now we're trying to load it with true, and that's not good. And the same thing is if this is false and the true iterator has already been set, that means that one has been loaded already. So what we want to do is, if the content is enabled and the false iterator is a proper iterator, I don't do like this because we can't assign to this. Just make this clear. Okay, so now if we ask for this asset with content enabled true, but the false iterator is a proper iterator, then we want to warn that try to load asset blah with content enabled true but was loaded with false before. And now we're passing in our name. And then the same thing the other way around. So if content enabled and our true iterator is a proper iterator, and I guess I'm really lazy to write this method twice. So if we say this one's the first, or we have our second one here, collecting our braces, there we go. Guess we're not going, yep, that one's wrong. So we have one here, nope, that was not wrong. So we have our end, this one, this one, this one, this one, and we need one more. Yeah, that seems to be correct. Good. Okay, so now we can say try download with content enabled blah, but loaded with blah before. And then this one would be content enabled and not content enabled. This should be fine. And I guess if we want to make things very clear, we can also say that true it. Tired of writing this. Just make this a bit shorter. So now we have some variables for this. They don't fit fits into one line, and it looks much nicer. Okay, so now we're checking if we're actually trying to load the opposite, but what has happened? Something might have gone horribly wrong already, and we don't want to, right? This could be potentially pretty brittle and not really detectable at load time, so we want to check that better. So what we want to do is if has true it and has false it, so which means that we have loaded it at some point with true and we have loaded it with false, then we want to put out a new warning just to be on the safe side. Maybe a bit verbose, but well, we can deal with it later. So asset blah has been loaded with hello has been loaded with content enabled true and false before, and well, this to do basically did now, but we this should be replaced with a much better solution. Maybe a two-phase lookup of asset not lookup, approach of asset creation, maybe. So then we don't need to warn about it, but we can actually deal with that as well. So if both of them has been set, that's a problem. If one or the other ones has been set, that's not a problem. So let's see, do we need this? I guess what we want to do now is our iterator should be the one that's actually here. And then we place it in here. There we go. Even though Visual Studio doesn't like it, this actually should be working. Ugh. So no, we want. I guess what we want to do is actually just do this and move that into place. Doesn't really matter too much, but this one should work. It does not evaluate to a function that takes one parameter. Interesting. Okay, so this would be where do you get called from? This is incredibly unhelpful. So if we want to remove an asset, I guess all of this will go terribly wrong anyway if we have multiple assets. So let's just try it with both. Just leave us a to-do here. We can know how to fix it later. There we go. So we check, do the same thing again. Check first whether it's true. Then we check if it's false. Time-wise, it doesn't really matter that much. We're going to do this so often, so seldomly that it doesn't really impact any performance. So if if true iterator is a proper iterator, we return whichever that pointed to. Otherwise, we check this one. If false iterator is a proper iterator, whoops, we return false iterators pointed to thing. And now we have, if not, well, we don't have anything, and we just return a null pointer, and hope that nothing will blow up. Okay, still the same problem. Illegal expression. I'm assuming that it can't compute the hash out of a pair. Well, that one sucks. So how would we deal with that? Do we? Well, we have a number of parameters. Since we have assets as file names, there are a couple of parameters, a couple of things that we can't use as characters. That seems really ugly. Tracked assets down here. Maybe what we want to do instead is store a struct of assets. We'd also need to tear all of that apart afterwards again. Yikes. So struct should be temporary, and we want to remove this. So proper solution is in place. We call the struct tract key with a string, which is the name, and the bool whether content is enabled. Now instead of a pair, we're having a tract key. And now I need to override some method to check if the hash is calculated somehow. No one can remember that. It's probably some overload for the std_hash function. This one should be. Yeah, there we go. Do we need an actual hasher? No, we can do this. Yeah. Great. So take our key somewhere up here. We need to place it into the namespace, into the std namespace. This can disappear. So we open up our namespace. Well, not our namespace. Std namespace. Specific template for asset loader. How do we call it? Tract key. It's probably complaints that tract key doesn't exist, which is I guess so. Oh, fuck it. Should probably also not be public. But whatevs. Okay, so now this one shouldn't complain anymore. So we get our hashing. operator. So we pass in our tracked key. Should probably be const expert as well, but well, who cares? So now the thing is that we know that we can't have certain characters because our name is referring to a file name. Name of K refers to a file on disk, which comes with restrictions on the characters that are allowed. So if we use a non-allowed character as separator, we are guaranteed to be safe from user manipulation, because no user can create a file that has actually the same character in it. So that's good. So what we can do is, which character would we want to take? Separator. And let's just take guess you really don't like. No, this one you like. Which one do we not like? There we go. Vertical pipe. Pipe's good. There we go. So now what we have is we have a std string of our name plus our pipe character plus content enabled. We say true, otherwise we say false. And now we returned hash of a string of our result. Happier? Why are you not happy? Do I need to? I need to call it on the string. God, this is stupid. Error explicit initialization. Track key has already been initiated. What the heck? Previous definition. But it hasn't. Did our key tries to forward declare this, or oh my god, doesn't seem reasonable. What does standard hash do? It seems like hash should know something about pairs. This is exactly what we did. I guess we should actually do it no except, because we don't actually throw any exceptions. Did not help. Hash. While compiling list iterator. God, it's not fun. So if we do we need a hasher for the map? I don't think so. now we just need to be able to compare them. Well, that's much nicer. Do we need the fact that it's unordered? No, not really. So now we can move this down here again and actually... Probably the pair should have an overloaded less than operator. Let's do this. Go. Is anyone unhappy in here? No. Well, that's great. Much better. So if we compile this, nothing should have changed. So loading up. False, that's still the case. Yes. So we're loading it with false. Our grid doesn't show up. Okay. So everything's still good. Let's just make 100% sure that everything's still good. Now we're loading it up with true. And there's our grid. Great. Okay, so yeah, everything still works. But now we want to check if we actually did it correct. So if I first load true, then we load false, it should be visible, but we should get a warning that we have done something wrong. Yes, so we loaded with true and then something happened and it should be visible. Yes. True, then we try to load an asset required test. There should probably be some ticks around that. But it's not really possible to see where the error message begins. With content enabled false, but was loaded with true before. Okay, so I guess the question is, if one of those warnings happen, do we actually want to continue? Because now we're getting the problem that we're trying to add the grid twice. And with the scene graph node, that's not really a problem. But with something else, like layers or something like that, which we want to use for this as well, we would get a problem because then we're loading it twice. So I guess what we want to do is not initialize it and just return the original one. Could that be bad? That potentially could be bad. But it works. So if we have the false iterator, we return well, we bind it to an actual shared pointer first. Not sure why this one should be a null pointer, but not it, but it's funcsit. And we already, no, we didn't already check it. Let's do this one first. Well, if it's both, yeah, we'll just get a lot of error messages or warnings if it's both, which should never be the case anyway. We then check if the true it. Return this one, and this should actually not be in here, but that's true. There we go. So now we are returning the one that has already been created and we're not getting. So if we're compiling again, we should at least not get the error message that something horribly went wrong. Everyone's favorite waiting game. So now we should be getting a warning, just one fatal message, yep. And we loaded it with true before, so the grid should be visible, yes. And if we switch these two, it should be exactly the opposite. Did try to load with true, but it was loaded with false, and we should have no grid. Great. All right, that calls for another git commit. Oh, yeah, this one I don't want to be reminded of. Just keeping this a bit cleaner. There we go. Emit a warning if we try to load assets with true and false. And let's just make sure that we didn't break anything for anyone else. So if we don't use our test case, but we load our default scene instead. This might take a while to compile. Yeah, it's gonna take too long. Let's try it in debug. So I guess the problem is what to do rather than just warn if you try to load it with false and with true. So one thing we definitely don't want to do is introduce more parameters to this, because the nice thing with this content enable true and false is that if at some point someone requests an asset to be with assets enabled, then we can just say that, okay, those will be enabled. So we just basically OR those parameters together. But the problem is that, as we saw, when we try to load them, we have to check if they've already been loaded or not. And so we have to decouple the initialization and the creation phase of the assets so that we can create them all at once beforehand and then throw away the ones where we have it set to false, but we also have one with true, and then only initialize the ones that are true. I guess that could work with the setup that we have, but I guess some nicer way of handling this would be, rather than putting this Boolean variable into the key of the map, for each name we store 2 pointers to an asset, which one of them would be the one with true, one of them would be the one with false, and then we throw away the ones that we don't actually want anymore afterwards. So I guess that could be a solution. But right now, one of the problems is that essentially we're doing so much work. Or is that a problem? Yeah, I guess so. Because we need to run this asset in order to figure out which other assets this requires. And if we're running this already and we're creating all of the radial grid, well, in this case, it's a hidden uninitialized method that gets called at some later stage. So if this code would have some side effects, we would be running this code potentially twice, which would be not good. So we would need to figure out a way to basically move all of these different definitions into the uninitialized method, or create a new callback, something like onCreate or something like that, that we can ensure that people are not doing any side effects during their initialization phase. But, well, we got one warning. That's probably the NASA Gibbs. It sometimes doesn't parse. Let's see, where are you? Okay, let's just load up the logs. Yes, so we didn't load the Gibbs. We got one warning. Something wrong with the server. Get another warning. So our default scene still works. So that's great. All right. Yeah, I wanted to keep this to about an hour, and we're pretty much bang on with an hour. So, well, thanks y'all for watching. We'll see if we'll do this another time, but it looks pretty promising already. And I'm pretty sure that we can make something happen for either this release or definitely the one afterwards. So yeah, thanks y'all.